test you on the different chips, but I'd like you to have a general idea of what the BDI index is and what it's used for on the final exam. But again, one of the best indicators for the global economy, and one of the most commonly referred to, and one that came up particularly last week because, as we see, it hit a 19-month peak amid confidence that is returning to the global economy as coronavirus restrictions are being relaxed and people are starting to come out and spend money. Any questions here? Okay. Well, so as I said before, an increasing BDI suggests an acceleration in global activity, just the way a decreasing BDI suggests a deceleration in global economic activity. So in terms of reviewing where we were last week, in the end of chapter 8, we focused in particular on variable levies and tariffs. Yes. And we said what? A variable levy and tariff is just like a regular levy, except that it moves up or down depending upon the price of the producer. If the producer lowers his price, well, then the levy goes up. If the producer raises, if the producer lowers his price, the tariff increases. Yes? No matter where the producer lowers his or her prices to, the tariff will rise or fall so that the price support that the government has made available to the producer is going to be maintained. So what did we see here? We saw that free trade, the world price was $3.50, and we indicate the demand and supply and the imports. We saw that the tariff of $1 was imposed to assure that the revenue would be $4.50 a bushel of wheat for the domestic producers. We saw then that the world price fell to $2.50, but what happens is that the tariff, which varies on a daily scale, went up to $2, therefore ensuring that the producers would get their their $4.50 worth of income. Are there any questions on that? Okay. We talked about common currency, the positives, the advantages and disadvantages of common currency. And what did we say was the major disadvantage of a common currency like the euro, like we see with the euro and the eurozone, where you have a monetary union without a fiscal union? What's the major thing that nations have to relinquish in order to participate in that common market?
Loss of
They give up
control in
sovereignty.
printing money.
Pardon me?
I
Go
said
ahead.
like they give up they can give up sovereignty, like their sovereignty.
Well, they give up part of their sovereignty. They give up their right to manage their domestic monetary policy. Okay, so that they can't, for example, during a crisis, devalue their currency. Okay, so the fact that nations must relinquish their domestic monetary tools in order to join the European Union is one of the major disadvantages or drawbacks of joining the common market. One of the major advantages of joining the market is what? Is that you benefit from all the reciprocity that's involved with being a member of a very large market, which is the elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers and the free movement of goods, services, and labor among all of these member nations, which is, as we've seen over the course of the last 11 years since the debut of the, over the course of the last 9 years since the debut in 2002 of the euro, is that the trade benefits, yes, the trade creation effects outweigh the trade diversion effects on the whole in the European Union. What did we say is one of the problems with the common agricultural policy? It's that efficiency is different from nations to nations, from farming regions to farming regions, and therefore the price supports that are given within the European Union are a source of contention or a source of controversy, where one nation, which is more inefficient than another nation, argues that the first nation is receiving unfair support from the government as opposed to the nation that is placing the complaint. We said that NAFTA is not. We said that NAFTA is not considered a. Excuse me. We talked about. I'm sorry, I lost my place here. We talked about an optimal currency area. That's right. We talked about an optimal currency area, and we said that is the EU an optimal currency area, and is NAFTA an optimal currency area? So can someone tell us, Alec, is the EU an optimal currency area?
I don't think so.
They're not. They haven't achieved what they set out to achieve. In other words, the objective was full integration. What's been a roadblock to full integration?
Well, the countries are inherently different, so
Good.
they're culturally different. They don't speak the
Right.
same language. So that I think that's the biggest barrier as I can see. But also the fact that all the countries were exporting countries, and then once they all became as one, I think that power of exporting, their advantage that they had decreased. There is too much competition among the countries
Okay.
within the European Union.
Okay, that's very good. Can anyone add anything to that? What are the reasons? Is the EU an optimum currency area? We say that that's the objective, full integration, that it would be fully integrated and become a full economic monetary union. What stood in the road? What stood in the way of that? Certainly, there are cultural differences. Also, there are regulatory differences. What else? Differences in what?
Didn't we say the difference in currency?
Not differences in currency, differences in tax systems, differences in justice systems, differences in administration, differences in culture, differences in corruption control. Some nations within the EU are intolerant of corruption, and others are more tolerant of corruption. And so, yes, the EU has set out to be an optimum currency area, but we saw in 2008 is that it's far less than an ideal, because what we have is we have a fiscal union. We have a currency union without a fiscal union. So in the United States, if Texas experiences a catastrophic collapse of its electric infrastructure and turns to the federal government for help, where does the aid from the federal government come from? It doesn't come from outer space. It comes from Floridians and New Hampshireites. It comes from folks in North Carolina. It comes from folks in California. It comes from folks in Idaho. It comes from folks from all over the country, because those are the mechanisms within the monetary union here in the United States. That mechanism doesn't exist in the European Union. So that during the Great Recession, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, Greece, these countries were on the verge of collapse. There was no mechanism in place to make sure that they got the so-called federal aid that Texas got during the collapse in its electric infrastructure that we saw last week. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Okay, and so the comment that I made last week, that what is the solution? The solution has to be either further integration within the Eurozone over time, or there'll be ongoing fracture, there'll be ongoing problems, much like we've seen now in Brexit, which of course is not fully completed. And so you talked about the optimum currency area in the Eurozone, but what about NAFTA? Is if NAFTA, if they don't have they don't have the same currency, but what? What do they share? Why is there such a strong degree of economic integration made possible between the US, Canada, and Mexico?
On the economy.
They share the same.
Economy.
Well, they don't. They share enormous economic interests. They share. They're geographically proximate. Absolutely. They're all three of them stable, advanced economies. That's a big plus. That share geographic proximity. So yes, those are all very good answers. Thank you. Yes. And so
I have that they share the on a strong economy integration.
pardon me?
I'd have that they do share the strong integration in economy.
Well, they do. They do share a strong degree of economic integration, but they don't share a common currency, which is a cornerstone of being defined as an optimum currency area, right? Like the EU shares the euro. And so you're absolutely right. These three nations don't share. However, they are very economically integrated. And the reason is because they're stable, advanced economies, as was pointed out, that share geographic proximity. And again, as you're emphasizing now. Do we agree? Yes?
We do.
Good, fantastic. So we're taking a look at some new material. We're going to start talking about the multinational. You know, what do we define as the multinational? Well, we know that it's the firms that can exploit resources available to them to around the world, whether it's factor inputs like labor, new technology, products, or managerial skills that can be tapped in markets all around the world at the push of a button or the push of a link on an iPhone. And so what we know is that subsidiary networks allow firms to maximize their profits, to optimize their profits. And one of the ways that they do that is by minimizing their taxes around the world. Which is one of the reasons why Joe Biden has proposed a global minimum tax on companies around the world, that nations would impose on companies around the world, making it harder for countries to evade taxes. One of the biggest exports in Ireland over the course of the last 30 years has been what, in terms of attracting direct foreign investment?
A low corporate tax rate?
Do you know what it is? It's the lowest.
Is it like less than 20%?
Indeed it is.
17%?
12.
Yes, who said that? Guys in there.
I did.
You did.
Is it Ireland?
It's 12.5%.
Ireland.
That's in Ireland, right?
In Ireland. And so therefore, one of the cases I worked on years ago was Nike moving to Ireland as opposed to building a facility up in Lawrence, Massachusetts. It was either going to go to expand within Massachusetts or build in Dublin or outside of Dublin. And it went to Dublin. And one of the reasons it did is because of the phenomenal tax breaks it was offered both short and long term by the government of Ireland. Ireland's been phenomenally successful as a low tax haven with 12.5% corporate interest rates, corporate tax rates, not interest rates, tax rates. And therefore, I think that that's just the tip of the iceberg of the type of pushback we can expect to see against the global minimum tax, not only from low tax haven nations like Ireland, but from wealthy corporations that enjoy the chess game of moving profits around the world, and of course, wealthy individuals that have considerable sway in politics around the world, certainly here in the United States. And so I think that before we get to the GMT, we're going to expect to see some pushback. But wherever we make progress, that's good news in terms of rebalancing our tax policies so they're less regressive and more progressive. But I don't want to get too lost in the weeds on that. Let's return to the idea of the multinational enterprise. And so we talk about the welfare of the source and host nations are being enhanced with resources being moved from lower to higher productive resources and global resources being allocated more efficiently through the multinational enterprise that's able to exploit comparative advantages around the world, break up the iPhone into its component parts and mine the manufacturing capability of 7 different nations to produce those parts and then ship them all to China and have them assembled into a finished product, the iPhone, and Foxconn that gets shipped through supply chains all over the world. This is considered a good thing. The comment about the taxes, of course, is an ancillary issue with regard to multinationals. Talk about multinationals, there are different types of integration. There's vertical integration, horizontal integration, and conglomerate integration. So we say that vertical integration is when the subsidiary is producing intermediate and finished goods that benefit from scale economies and specialization. Now, there are 2 types of vertical integration. There's backward vertical integration and forward vertical integration. So forward vertical integration means it's in the direction of the final consumer. So think about the car companies. They manufacture cars, there's your end product, and then they develop subsidiary networks through a hub and spoke model, like the wheel of a bicycle. So you have the manufacturer here, and then you have spokes of a wheel coming out, and all of those spokes, like you see on the wheel, are your subsidiary distributors around the world, around the nation. Okay, that's an example of forward integration. Backward integration is when the company is producing all of the component parts, the extraction material, processing raw materials like oil companies do, or metal manufacturers do. That's backward integration. Horizontal integration just means that companies are developing subsidiaries that all produce the same goods. So think of, for example, Coca-Cola. And then conglomerate integration, which is companies that diversify into non-related markets. So you have companies like Koch Industries that are oil manufacturers, oil producers, industrial manufacturers, but also paper manufacturers, and involved in lots of different businesses. Can anyone else think of a conglomerate?
LVMH.
LVMH is a good conglomerate. That's very good. Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, very good. LVMH, ITT is a good example of a conglomerate. Yes, that's an excellent one. LVMH. Okay. So we know that sales can be intra-firm, which is how we get to transfer pricing, right? So that the value is determined by factors other than a competitive pricing system, because multinationals are allocating profits between subsidiaries to minimize their taxes, and that can have that oftentimes has nothing to do with a competitive pricing system, and more to do with minimizing taxes and moving profits offshore, which leads to another set of issues which we're going to talk about now. We talk about sources of conflict. They're generally centered around three big things: employment, transfer technology, and national sovereignty. So we talk about employment. Is the recipient country going to be positively impacted, and will the source country be negatively impacted? Those are considerations. So if the US sees manufacturing moving overseas, well, then we're going to see the source country, the US, see its employment hurt, while we're going to see the recipient country, let's say labor in China, is going to improve. That can be, of course, a source of conflict, as is here in the US, as manufacturing jobs have been exported to low-cost markets over the last 30 years. And we've seen millions of people displaced, and not enough done to respond to the depth of that fallout. The hope is that we're doing better now. The point is, though, is that it remains a source of conflict, and one that we consider here. We talk about technology transfer via trade or direct foreign investment as companies do business around the world. Yes, and so there are two types of technology transfer: either the demonstration effect, which is seen when subsidiaries interact with local firms, or through the competition effect, which is what? Multinationals moving around the world force other companies, domestic companies, to innovate, to fine-tune their operational strategies to remain competitive in a competitive global market where foreign firms are allowed to do business domestically, and therefore they raise the game and compel domestic firms to either remain competitive, to remain innovative, to increase their productivity, or to be forced out of business. That, of course, is going to have a major response from the host government. Host governments that see foreign nationals or foreign companies as a direct threat to domestic labor are going to be much less accommodative than they might otherwise be to a company that is coming, that is going to have a positive impact on the local economy, as opposed to one that's detrimental. In terms of national sovereignty, well, the fear is always that what? What is the effect going to be of a US company or some other Russian company, a German company, a French company, a Chinese company coming into a particular host country and setting up a flag? What is going to be the impact of BMW coming down to Spartanburg, South Carolina, in order to set up a manufacturing facility that's going to employ upwards of 15,000 people? That's not going to go unnoticed. That's going to have a major footprint for a foreign producer in the United States, and therefore it's going to have an impact on the economics and politics of the region, whether it's locally or, of course, more broadly regionally or even nationally. And we've talked about that with regard to BMW and the steps that BMW took to engender support to develop stakeholders in its success, whether it was by keeping a thin equity base, by borrowing from multiple sources, or hiring local labor in order to not only benefit from the skills of local labor, but to create goodwill among the community, so on and so forth. So we know that nations fear the result of the loss of national sovereignty when multinationals come and set up shop. And that's a reasonable fear. We've seen over the years that multinationals can shift their profits overseas. They can evade their taxes of the host country, and they can try to influence domestic policy. We've seen that with ITT in Chile and Chiquita Barons in Honduras, two incidents that are often referred to when we talk about threats to national sovereignty and are cited in your book. In terms of Burger King, I wanted to talk about that for a moment. Does anybody have burgers from Tim Hortons? Anybody eat a Tim Horton burger lately?
Nope.
Okay, so back in 2014, Burger King buys Tim Hortons, right? Canadian company, the US and Tim Hortons merge. You have a very big company, the US Burger King, merging with a much smaller company, Tim Hortons out of Canada. So the US multinational Burger King buys a company in a tax positive country, which has lower taxes, Canada. The two companies merge into one firm, which is exactly what happened. The new firm renounces its US citizenship. What's the trick, though? The trick is that the new firm still gets most of its revenues from where?
The US.
That's exactly right. It still gets most of its revenue from the United States. However, it declares that its new country, in this case Canada, is its tax domicile and adopts a lower rate despite most of its revenue coming still earned in its home country. It's perfectly legal. Does anyone know what it's called?
Tax avoidance.
It is called tax avoidance. It has another name, though, which is earnings stripping. You're stripping your earnings out of the country of origin. That's what it's called, earnings stripping. It's a type of tax avoidance. Very good. Thank you, Alec. So we talk about sources of conflict with multinational. Well, of course, with balance of payments. We have the current account, exports minus imports, plus the capital account, capital inflows minus outflows, plus foreign exchange balances. We know that the export of goods and services, of course, is a positive factor because it represents capital inflows. We know that direct foreign investments is a negative factor because it represents money leaving the country, leaving the US, or leaving Israel or China or whatever the country may be. But what's the question, though? The question is yes, there's short-term capital in and out of the country, but there's also the long-term positive effects on global trade and earnings. So what we're really talking about is, with regard to the balance of payments equation, is the conflict that arises of static or short-term gains versus longer-term dynamic gains. Okay? So we move along and we talk about direct foreign investment and revenue-related motives. We identify what are the reasons that companies want to move their money abroad. Think about it. Well, they want to make more money. They want to exploit cheap markets. They want to open up some sort of subsidiary that can take advantage of its comparative advantage or competitive advantage in the local marketplace. So again, exploit comparative advantage, tap into new sources of demand, enter new markets through an acquisition, or establish a subsidiary to pursue some type of international diversification.
It is also a method of hedging, right?
It's also a method of hedging. That's exactly right. That's diversification. In other words, the argument is that a multinational through DFI can develop a mechanism in which it's able to smooth its earnings. It's doing bad in one market in one particular season while it's doing better in another market in another season. It's doing better in the Northern Hemisphere at one point of the year while it's doing better at the same point in the Southern Hemisphere. And And also, of course, to react to trade restrictions. Once strong trade restrictions are put in place, we oftentimes see a migration of direct foreign investment capital moving out of one nation to another in order to avoid trade restrictions. So we've identified revenue-related motives. What about cost-related motives? Well, as we said, you want to exploit foreign production factors like inexpensive land, labor, capital, or technology. You want to respond to foreign exchange changes. Suddenly the yuan is strengthening tremendously and you've seen your profit margins compressed by 15%. You might explore moving your production capacity from Shenzhen in China to Malaysia, for example, or to Vietnam, for example. Another cost-related motive, of course, is to build scale economies. Scale economies allow us to bring down our average total costs or average variable costs. And of course, as an incentive to direct foreign investment, when direct foreign investment is going to solve some type of problem by improving employment or introducing technology into a particular country without taking business from local companies, that company, the foreign national, the foreign company, is likely to be richly rewarded by the host government through a variety of things that it can do, like we've said with Ireland, whether it's low corporate taxes or through all types of elimination. For example, Nike, they didn't pay property taxes for 10 years in Ireland. A suspension of state and local taxes, along with a low corporate tax rate. These are all things that are used to incentivize direct foreign investment for companies that are not only going to be value additive. They're going to bring technology. They're going to bring employment, so on and so forth. We talk about the path of direct foreign investment and the options that companies have. We can boil it down very simply into a DFI sequence map. And so we sit down with a company and say they want to explore opportunities to establish overseas subsidiaries that can allow it not only to diversify its earnings, but to maximize its profits. And so the first thing the company needs to do is it needs to identify its comparative advantages. Then it needs to have developed its scale economies. Now it has to decide whether it's going to exploit its competitive advantages abroad or at home. So it can produce at home or abroad. And if it produces abroad, what does the question become? The question becomes one of control. A company can produce abroad through licensing contracts. What's the problem with licensing contracts? Licensing contracts means you've relinquished a lot of control to someone else that is going to produce your product for a fee. That can be problematic. The next step is to say, well, I don't want to relinquish so much control. I'm going to enter into a joint venture or into some type of wholly owned affiliate. There are problems with joint ventures. What's the big problem with joint ventures? Can anyone give us a shorthand answer? Fantastic. There's a lot of risk associated with joint ventures. Very hard to find a good partner. If you've ever worked together in groups in school, as I remember very well, sometimes there's not a fair division of labor. Sometimes someone does very little work and someone does much more work than everybody else. That's not always the case, but sometimes the case. And there can be problems with partnerships, joint ventures. So finding a partner that you can work with fairly and equitably, who, when there are challenges, is not going to bail on you or bail on the company and has the wherewithal to manage during difficult times, because there's always difficult times and challenges. That's a very good thing. That's a very lucky thing to have. As I said, is one of the pitfalls of a joint venture. Of course, things are always great when the money's coming in and everybody loves you. But if suddenly things go bad, you don't meet your targets for a quarter, and suddenly your money's running out, things can become pretty tricky. And so again, a lesson for the future: JVs are great as long as you have the right partner. So let's say the company is passed on licensing contracts, decides JV, still not enough control. the company has one of two options. It can pursue a direct acquisition, which means it's buying an old facility, an old company, an old facility somewhere. So let's say that BMW was to come in and buy an existing automotive facility. So the Ford Explorer was a huge success for Ford, redefined their fortunes. And then, of course, we know that the demand for the Ford Explorer plummeted in the late 90s, and Ford was left with multiple plants that couldn't be used for anything. BMW, well, other than make the Ford Explorer, for which the demand had completely evaporated, as people became more and more conscious of the devastating effects of greenhouse gases. And so BMW could have bought one of those former Ford Explorer manufacturing facilities. It did not, though. Why? Because it decided to go another route, which was the greenfield investment, which is literally what it sounds like. There's a greenfield, and they went and said, okay, we're coming with our smarts and with our agenda, not with our money, because we're going to borrow a lot of money, and we're going to start from scratch. That's basically what it is. It's a greenfield, and we start from scratch, which gives you the ultimate degree of control. Now, licensing makes sense for certain people. JVs make sense for certain people and companies, as do direct acquisitions and greenfield investments. I just wanted to put this out here tonight as an introduction on DFI. Are there any questions here? Okay.
Yes, Professor, I have a question. So for direct acquisition and the greenfield is on both the joint ventures and the wholly owned subsidiary, or it is going to be like directly from the wholly owned?
Well, a wholly owned affiliate can be one of two things. It can be a greenfield investment, or it can be a direct acquisition.
But not the joint venture, right?
But not a joint venture. That's
Okay.
exactly right. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's go back to where we were. Okay, so let's turn our attention to hedging. I posted for you answers to chapter 8 this morning on Blackboard. We're now into chapter 9. I told you to only read up through joint ventures in chapter 9 in Carbo. And now I'd like to add to our toolkit by talking about interest rate parity and purchasing power parity as a means for forecasting spot rates, which are all important when you're operating as a global manager in a global economy where there are multiple foreign exchange rates that are constantly exposing you to either reduce profit or increase cost. So the theory of interest rate parity tells us that interest rate differentials between nations are reflected in the forward premium or discount of their respective currencies. And so therefore, we turn our attention to the idea of purchasing power parity that says that the relative purchasing power should be the same whether you're buying goods at home or abroad. And that spot rates adjust to reflect inflation differentials. So interest rate parity is with regard to interest rate differentials reflected in the forward premium or discount of their currencies. And purchasing power parity tells us that relative purchasing power should be the same. So whether you're buying a Big Mac in the US or you're buying a Big Mac in Paris, New York or Paris, basically the price should be exactly the same, right? So let's talk about the purchasing power parity exchange rate. Well, we can compare the prices of similar products in two different countries. The classic example that I like to use is the Big Mac example. So a Paris Big Mac costs €3.01 versus New York City, where it's just about $2.99 for the Big Mac, right? So the question is what is the purchasing power exchange rate, the implied spot rate for €1? Well, all we do is say, we're going to create an equation where we say the purchasing power parity euro-US dollar exchange rate is simply based upon the price of these two products in these two markets. So what is the value of €1? What is the implied dollar value of €1? Well, how many times does the dollar go into the euro? You say 301 divided by 299 gives us euro dollar 0.99. €1 gets us 99 cents. how many times does the euro go into the dollar? The euro buys us how many dollars? We've got to divide the dollar by the euro, gets us euro dollar 99 cents. If we know that that's your implied spot rate based upon the price of the same product in two different markets. If the euro spot rate is, as it is right now, $1.20, we can compare the implied spot rate to the actual spot rate to determine whether the dollar is overvalued or undervalued against the euro using the ratio of implied over actual -1. So look how the technique works. We say the implied was 99 cents over the actual $1.20 -1 gives us the percentage of 17.5%. So what's the conclusion? That the dollar is undervalued against the euro by about 18%, and therefore appreciation is expected. What the purchasing power parity exchange rate is telling us is that right now the euro is overvalued and the dollar is undervalued based upon the price of these two exactly the same products in these two markets, Paris and New York. I'm going to give you homework on this material that we're going to go over this week in hedging for the weekend. But in the meanwhile, I want you to look at this, absorb it, and let's move on and talk about the international Fisher effect. We're looking at tools that managers use to assess foreign exchange rate changes, right? Which, of course, is critically important. So the international Fisher effect was developed by Irving Fisher, a renowned economist back in the 1950s. And what he did was he created a powerful forecasting tool used to assess foreign exchange risk. He said that spot rate changes are due to inflation differentials. And so a country that has very high inflation like Brazil is going to have a weak currency, and a country with very low inflation like the US is going to have a strong currency, just like I write here, okay? He reclassified interest rates as what? As nominal rates that have two components. Does anyone know what those two components are? There's a real rate of return, and yes, thank you. See, I kind of gave the answer, but I was waiting for you like a teammate. We did it together. So you have the nominal rate has a real rate of return plus an inflation rate. So if the nominal rate that you're getting at the bank is 3% and inflation rate is 2%, that means you're really only earning 1%. Okay? So the real rate of return plus your expected inflation rate. So we set up the equation. The nominal rate is the real rate plus the expected inflation rate. That means our real return is the nominal return that we're being offered at the bank, less than whatever the inflation rate is. Okay? So Fisher's simple but powerful forecasting tool that's used all the time by global managers to assess expected foreign exchange rate changes is the formula C in front of you. We derive the forward premier discount using the money market interest rates at home and the money market interest rates abroad with the formula 1 plus the interest rate at home as over the 1 plus the interest rate in the foreign market minus 1. And so what's important to remember here with the Fisher effect is that rates are going to adjust always to inflation expectations, as we know. There's a big but, though. They don't move exactly with inflation because of differences in what? Trade balances, regulation, growth, macroeconomic, and of course, geopolitical events. But the international Fisher effect has proven to be a reliable guide for foreign exchange rate changes over the course of the last 70 years. And so let's take a look here at an example. We see the expected real return, inflation rate, and nominal rate in the US and Mexico as follows. That means the nominal rate in the US is 5, and in Mexico it's 14. If the spot rate in Mexico was $1 buys peso 20.7039, $1 buys Mexican peso 20.7039, and the spot rate in Mexico is that the Mexican peso buys 0.0483. If a US firm has 1 year Mexican peso payable, the question is use IFE, the Fisher effect, to determine the 1 year expected percent change in the peso. We're just going to use Fisher, right? You just say 1.05 over 1.04, 1.14 minus 1, the home rate over the foreign rate minus 1, tells us 7.89%. What does that mean? We expect that the peso is going to depreciate against the dollar by 7.98% over the course of the next year. So then we just say the spot rate is, the expected spot rate is what it is today, 0.0483 times less the 7.89% gives us 0.0445 is what we expect it to be in 1 year based upon the Fisher effect. So any questions here? Okay. Well then, let's go through one more problem before we break for this evening that uses the Fisher effect. And so, I'm sorry, what did we do here? What did I do here? We got the 1 year Mexican spot, and then we gave you the dollar spot. How do we get the dollar spot? All I did for the dollar spot was you took the inverse of the spot, Mexican spot, to give us the expected dollar spot. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. In 1 year, the Mexican based on IFE, the peso is expected to buy me about 5 cents. And in 1 year, the dollar is expected to buy me roughly 22.5 pesos. So let's take a look at this problem here, and then we're going to break for the evening. I had a couple more after it, but I'm gonna hold off on that. Let's see in our final 7 or 8 minutes we can get this done. So here you have an example of a company in Florida that I know that had contracted with Aeromexico to build airplanes and deliver them in 3 years with a payment of 1.8 billion pesos due on delivery. The peso dollar spot was 0.0534. It's a little over 5 cents. The dollar, the US and Mexico relevant rates, the 1 year rates, were projected in 4 and 9% for the entire 3 year term. And so the question that we faced was what? If the company uses a forward hedge and interest rate parity exists, in other words, we can use the international Fisher effect, what is the expected dollar amount the company is going to receive in 3 years? Well, we have to really determine what do we expect what's the peso going to look like in 3 years, because we're going to say what the peso looks like in 3 years, multiply it by our accounts payable, our accounts receivable of 1.8 billion, and that's going to be our answer. So what's the expected forward premium or discount? Well, all we do is we set up the equation like this. We have to remember, though, we have to take it to the third power because it's over 3 years. The interest rates are annual, okay? And so we expect the 3 year Mexican peso to be as follows, given the formula. We just plug in the 4 and 9%. We calculate it through, and what do we see? The expectation is that there's an expected 13.14% depreciation of the peso expected in 3 years based upon the international Fisher effect. And so just then we say, well, 13.14% off of the current spot of 5.34 cents gives us an expected spot rate in 3 years of 0.0464. Well, if the spot rate's 0.0464 in 3 years, what does that mean the proceeds of the company is going to be? Well, they're going to get 1.8 million pesos times the 0.0464. They're going to clear $83.52 million based upon the analysis using the international Fisher effect. Everyone see that? Like I said, a very simple but powerful forecasting tool when it comes to anticipating rate changes, which of course are a critical component of all the work that we do. Okay, folks. We're going to call it a night there. I want to thank you all for your kind attention this evening. I hope you have a good, safe continuation of your day, a good day tomorrow.